Hey, tonight we're diving into something a little twisted love stories, but not the kind you'd find in fairy tales. These are the romances that went too far. Obsession, betrayal, murder, and sometimes things even darker than that. History has a strange way of hiding the ugly behind the beautiful. And when love turns dangerous, the results can be unforgettable and deeply disturbing. If you're into this kind of late-night journey through the strange and unsettling, drop a like or hit subscribe. It really helps keep this going. And hey, I always love knowing where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Let's build this little global campfire together. Now dim the lights. Maybe light a candle if you're feeling brave. And let's slip back through time together. Because tonight, we're exploring the most disturbing love stories in history and the chilling ways they ended. Cleopatra didn't just walk into history, she slithered in with eyeliner sharp enough to cut a senator and a political playbook that would make Machiavelli blush. She was not the first Cleopatra, she was number 7, but she was the one who stuck, the one who turned Egypt into a political powder keg and Rome into a hot, jealous mess. And at the heart of her story, one of the most legendary and ultimately disastrous love affairs the world has ever seen. Her entanglement with Mark Antony. By the time Cleopatra met Antony, she was already infamous. She'd rolled herself up in a rug to seduce Julius Caesar and bore him a child, because of course she did. She didn't just charm men, she annexed them. Her command of languages, politics, and spectacle was unmatched. She wasn't just a queen, she was Egypt. Antony, on the other hand, was the kind of Roman general who swaggered before he strategized. Handsome, theatrical, and always looking for a good time, he was one of Caesar's most loyal allies, and after Caesar's assassination, one of the 3 men in charge of avenging him and stabilizing Rome. This setup should have made Antony a disciplined statesman. Instead, he headed east, right into Cleopatra's waiting arms. When the two finally met in 41 BCE in Tarsus, modern-day Turkey, Cleopatra didn't arrive like a diplomat. She arrived like a goddess. Draped in gold, sailing a barge decked out like the throne of Aphrodite, she knew exactly how to seize a man's attention. Antony, who never met a party he didn't like, was enthralled. And just like that, history's most operatic situationship began. They weren't just lovers, they were political partners, ego mirrors, and co-producers of a very expensive public spectacle. Cleopatra gave Antony something Rome couldn't: a throne, a fantasy, and unlimited alcohol. Antony gave Cleopatra the military backing to keep Egypt strong. Together, they threw wild banquets, played king and queen of the known world, and had 3 children. It was all very glamorous and very doomed. Rome, naturally, was not amused. Back home, whispers turned into roars. Why was a Roman general playing house with a foreign queen? Why was he dressing up in Egyptian robes and calling himself Dionysus? Octavian Caesar's heir and Antony's rival seized on this golden PR opportunity. He painted Antony as a man bewitched, emasculated, and enslaved by a seductive Eastern temptress. Cleopatra, to Roman minds, wasn't a queen, she was a sorceress, a threat, a scandal in eyeliner form. Eventually, the whole thing spiraled into war. Antony and Cleopatra, in full power couple delusion, declared their children rulers of vast eastern territories. Octavian, not having any of it, brought the Roman Senate against them. In 31 BCE, their fleets met off the coast of Greece at the Battle of Actium. What should have been an epic naval showdown turned into an awkward exit. Cleopatra's ships abruptly retreated mid-battle. Antony, like a man who forgot his keys at home, followed her. Their forces were crushed. Back in Egypt, the end approached like a slow, collapsing tent. Antony, desperate and paranoid, received false news that Cleopatra had died. Grief-stricken, he fell on his own sword and botched it. He didn't die immediately, instead bleeding out slowly while being dragged to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she was, in fact, very much alive. They shared a final embrace, one of those "we made a few mistakes" kind of moments, and then he died for real. Cleopatra, now cornered and out of moves, tried one last time to negotiate with Octavian. She offered him treasure, charm, and the possibility of a peaceful surrender. But Octavian wasn't here for romance. He was here for conquest. Realizing that she would be paraded through Rome as a war trophy, her worst nightmare, Cleopatra, took her own life. According to legend, it was by snakebite, although modern historians suspect it might have been poison smuggled in a fig basket. Either way, she made sure her death was as dramatic as her life. Octavian didn't get the full victory parade he wanted. Instead, he got a throne. With Cleopatra and Antony gone, he consolidated power and became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Egypt became a Roman province. Cleopatra's children were either killed, disappeared, or raised in obscurity. The dynasty ended. The queen's body was never found. What makes this love story disturbing isn't just the war, the blood, or the suicides, though there's plenty of that. It's the way power and passion blurred until they were indistinguishable. Cleopatra and Antony weren't just in love. They were in ambition together. Their affection was real, but so was their hunger. They built an empire on each other's strengths and collapsed under the weight of it. Their story reads like a Shakespearean tragedy, because it is one. Literally, Shakespeare dramatized the whole affair, turning them into tragic icons of love and downfall. History followed suit. Cleopatra was not the villain Rome made her out to be, nor was Antony merely a foolish romantic. They were two people caught in the gears of empire, seduced by each other and by their own myths. And when it all came crashing down, they died not as lovers, but as legends. Matching suicides, matching tombs, and the eerie silence of a city that once watched the world burn for a love story that couldn't survive it. If you ever think modern gossip culture is vicious, allow 18th century France to remind you that scandal has always been an Olympic sport, and nobody played it quite like the French aristocracy. At the center of this mess, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born Queen of France, with a taste for fashion, fountains, and the occasional reputation-shattering disaster. But the wildest part? In the affair of the diamond necklace, she wasn't even a participant. Just the headline act in a drama she never auditioned for. Let's rewind. It's the 1770s. France is deep in debt. The people are hungry, and the court at Versailles is spending like their powdered wigs are stuffed with gold. The Queen Marie Antoinette already has a PR problem. She's young, foreign, fashionable, and famously bad at pretending she's frugal. Never mind that the king is duller than a soup spoon. All eyes and blame are on her. By the time the diamond necklace scandal explodes, her popularity is dangling by a thread. And then comes one of the dumbest, boldest cons in history. Enter Cardinal de Rohan, a man who desperately wants to get back in the Queen's good graces. Rohan had managed to offend Marie Antoinette years earlier, mostly by gossiping about her mother, the Empress of Austria, like a drunken middle schooler at a sleepover. Since then, she'd frozen him out completely. Rohan, however, is a powerful clergyman with ambition, and he wants back into court life. What he lacks in dignity, he makes up for in gullibility. Enter Jeanne de la Motte, a con artist with noble blood, a gambling problem, and exactly zero shame. She smells opportunity in Rohan's desperation. Jean tells Rohan that she's actually very close with the Queen, totally BFFs, and that if he just plays his cards right, she could smooth things over. Maybe pass along a few letters. Maybe even arrange a secret meeting. The hook is baited. Rohan swallows it whole. Jean proceeds to orchestrate an entire fake relationship between the Cardinal and Marie Antoinette, using forged letters. These letters are syrupy, flirty, and allegedly written by the Queen herself. They suggest that she's interested in a personal reconciliation, one that involves diamonds. Rohan, now completely under the spell of this imaginary courtship, is ecstatic. The climax comes when Jean arranges a midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles. It's dark. Lanterns flicker. The air smells like rosewater and delusion. A woman dressed as the Queen appears, hands Rohan a rose, and whispers a few lines. It is not Marie Antoinette. It is a prostitute hired to look like her. But Rohan, who really wants to believe he's back in the Queen's favor, accepts it without blinking. Now comes the diamond part. Sometime earlier, A pair of jewelers had created an absurdly elaborate necklace, nearly 650 diamonds, worth more than most countries. They'd hoped to sell it to Louis XV, but he died. Then they tried Marie Antoinette, who famously declined, saying, "We have more need of ships than of necklaces." Ouch! So the jewelers, now desperate, offer the necklace to Rohan, thinking the queen will buy it through him. Jean, of course, intercepts this. She tells Rohan that the queen wants the necklace secretly. She just can't be seen buying something so extravagant. If he would be so kind as to purchase it on her behalf, it would mean so much. Rohan, still under the impression that he's Marie's secret suitor, agrees. The necklace is handed over. Jean promptly cuts it up, sells the diamonds, and skips town with her lover. Mission accomplished. But Versailles is a leaky ship, and the truth, as it tends to, floats. The jewelers want their money. Rohan wants acknowledgement. The queen is confused. The scandal hits the press like a cannonball. And even though Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with it, the public doesn't care. All they hear is, "The queen conned someone into buying her a diamond necklace while we're eating rats." Rohan is arrested in front of the entire court. Jean is eventually captured and branded with a V for voleuse thief. But Marie? She's convicted in the court of public opinion. Already painted as frivolous, foreign, and disconnected, this scandal confirms every ugly rumor. Even though she's technically the victim of identity theft, the people decide she's the villain. The nickname Madame Deficit sticks harder than ever. Cartoons depict her bathing in diamonds while peasants starve. The press explodes with scandalous pamphlets, each more grotesque than the last. The affair of the diamond necklace didn't just ruin reputations, it may have helped topple a monarchy. When the French Revolution kicks into gear a few years later, the Queen's head is already figuratively on the chopping block. In 1793, it becomes literal. In the end, the necklace, the one that wasn't even worn, becomes a perfect metaphor for Marie Antoinette's downfall. She didn't ask for it. She didn't benefit from it. But it sparkled just long enough to blind everyone to the truth. She was the target, not the schemer. And in a twist both tragic and absurd, a fake romance would play a very real role in the fall of France's last queen. Napoleon Bonaparte may have been a military genius, a self-made emperor, and the reason your high school history class spent 3 months talking about artillery logistics. But when it came to love, he was a mess. Not a tragic, brooding, Byron in a bathtub kind of mess. No, Napoleon was the write 20 sweaty love letters in 2 days and still get ghosted kind of mess. And the woman who caused this emotional battlefield? Josephine de Beauharnais, the widowed socialite, who stole his heart, his wallet, and eventually his peace of mind. They met in the hazy afterglow of the French Revolution. Josephine, born Marie Josephe Rose Tacher de la Pagerie, try fitting that on a dating profile, had already done a lap around the guillotine-adjacent social scene. Her first husband had been executed during the Reign of Terror. She narrowly avoided the same fate thanks to a well-timed political shift. When she met Napoleon in 1795, she was a glamorous, well-connected woman, 6 years his senior, with 2 children and an entire drawer full of admirers. Napoleon, on the other hand, was a scrappy, ambitious general with a bad haircut and a chip on his shoulder the size of Corsica. He fell hard. He renamed her Josephine, declared her his destiny, and launched a relentless romantic campaign. His letters, read like a teenage diary ghost-written by a caffeinated philosopher. He called her wicked, charming, irresistible. He also got mad when she didn't write back fast enough and accused her of breaking his heart while he was out conquering countries. There were more mood swings in his writing than on a roller coaster made of red flags. Josephine, to be fair, was not entirely sold on the short, intense Corsican with delusions of grandeur, but she was pragmatic, and Napoleon's star was rising. They married in 1796. Napoleon, ever the romantic, was immediately sent to invade Italy. From there, he wrote to her obsessively, detailing his victories, his jealousy, and his desire for her to stop hanging out with sexy men back in Paris. She, meanwhile, enjoyed the perks of being a general's wife and kept entertaining her pre-Napoleon social circle, which included a few men Napoleon would not have approved of. When he found out about her affairs, he was devastated. He raged. He sulked. Then he cheated too, because, balance. But even as their trust frayed and their marriage turned into a cold war with occasional truces, Napoleon stayed weirdly devoted. He made her empress when he crowned himself emperor. He bought her estates. He forgave. She smiled. And the whole time, neither of them stopped playing the game. The real heartbreak came not with betrayal, but with dynastic pressure. Josephine couldn't give Napoleon an heir a critical flaw for a man trying to build a literal empire with matching bloodlines. After years of trying, crying, and possibly hoping a miracle would just show up in a bassinet, Napoleon made the hardest political decision of his life. He divorced Josephine. In 1810, they held a ceremonial separation full of tears and awkward applause. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, younger, fertile, and about as romantic as a trade agreement. Josephine took it with grace. Sort of. She kept her title. She kept a palace. And she kept wearing gowns that screamed, "I still win." Napoleon, however, never really let go. Even as his empire crumbled, even as Europe closed in on him like a judgmental mother-in-law, he continued to write to her. During his exile on Elba, when he wasn't busy plotting a comeback, he thought of her. He called her his only true wife. When he heard she died in 1814 of pneumonia, after standing in the rain to show a Russian dignitary her roses, he locked himself in his room and refused to eat. He wept. He blamed fate. He probably reread her old perfume-stained letters and imagined her voice in the wind. It's easy to romanticize them, to turn their chaos into a kind of tragic opera. And to be fair, it was operatic. He was an emperor. She was a fallen aristocrat turned fashion icon. Together, they had power, fame, sex, betrayal, and a love that neither politics nor poor communication skills could fully extinguish. But here's the thing. Napoleon conquered half of Europe and still couldn't conquer the chaos in his own heart. Josephine, elegant and elusive, outlasted his throne. They were never quite right for each other, but they were unforgettable. The world watched them fall apart in slow motion, and somewhere between the battlefield and the boudoir, their love story became a cautionary tale that even the grandest empires can't protect you from heartbreak. Catherine the Great ruled the largest empire on earth, expanded its borders, modernized its laws, corresponded with Voltaire, and survived more palace coups than most people have hot meals. But if you ask the average person what they remember about her, odds are they'll bring up the horse. That ridiculous, anatomically impossible rumor that somehow became the lasting shadow on a woman who outwitted kings, crushed rebellions, and turned a medieval country into a superpower. The truth is, Catherine didn't die trying to seduce a stallion. She died of a stroke. But by then, her reputation had already been sabotaged by the Enlightenment equivalent of angry Reddit threads, gossipy, fragile men with printing presses. Let's back up. Catherine wasn't even Russian. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess who landed on the Romanov radar when Russia needed a bride for the sickly, awkward heir to the throne, Peter III. She converted to Orthodoxy, changed her name, and married Peter. It was not a fairy tale. He was weird, immature, and more into toy soldiers than actual politics or physical intimacy. Catherine, meanwhile, was brilliant, strategic, and incredibly aware that she was being groomed to stand next to a man she'd probably have to quietly shove out of the way if she ever wanted to get anything done. So she waited. She read. She built alliances. And when Peter finally became emperor, his reign lasted exactly 6 months before Catherine orchestrated a bloodless coup, backed by the military, the church, and a lot of people who liked her better. Peter abdicated, which in Romanov terms often meant was never seen again. And Catherine took the throne, not as a regent, not as a placeholder, as empress, the one in charge, and she ruled for 34 years. She didn't do it alone, of course. Catherine liked men. She liked them young, handsome, and frequently replaced. While male monarchs filled their courts with mistresses and illegitimate children, Catherine preferred a series of very official lovers, often promoted to cushy government jobs after their romantic contracts expired. It wasn't so much scandalous as it was openly pragmatic. She was powerful, unmarried, and determined not to live like a nun. Russian nobles even joked about it, not cruelly, but with a kind of national pride. Catherine could handle a budget, a war, and 3 lovers before breakfast. But the foreign press, particularly in France and England, took issue with this. Enlightenment thinkers loved her on paper. She was smart, wrote long letters, reformed laws, and brought Western philosophy to the Russian court. But she was also a woman in power. Worse, a woman with opinions. And absolutely worst of all, a woman who enjoyed herself. Cue the smear campaign. The rumors escalated that she'd died on the toilet, that she'd been crushed during an intimate encounter with a specially constructed harness and a horse, that she'd slept with hundreds of men. The horse story in particular was designed to be so grotesque, so humiliating, that no one could take her seriously ever again. It was invented decades after her death, probably by a group of jealous courtiers or exiled enemies, and stuck because people couldn't stand the idea of a powerful woman not being punished by the narrative. And yet, while the rumors swirled, Catherine got things done. She modernized Russia's legal code, expanded education, founded the Hermitage Museum, and colonized Crimea. She defeated the Ottoman Empire, crushed rebellions like the Pugachev Uprising, and played political chess with Frederick the Great, Joseph II, and every other male ruler who underestimated her. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot and Voltaire showed a mind sharper than most of Europe. She read everything, wrote constantly, and governed with a mix of iron, charm, and flair. Her love life, while colorful, wasn't the whole story, but history has a habit of reducing women to whatever can be whispered in scandalous tones. Napoleon invaded half of Europe and cheated on his wife constantly, and we call him a military genius. Catherine builds schools and beds a few courtiers, and suddenly she's the subject of barnyard jokes. She died in 1796, not under a horse, but quietly in her chambers after a stroke. Her funeral was state-level grand, but even before the candles went out, the gossip had already outlived her body. Historians spent the next 2 centuries either defending her or repeating the lies, depending on what narrative they wanted to tell. Today, we know better. Mostly. The horse rumor has been debunked countless times, but it lingers in the margins like an ugly footnote that refuses to fade. Still, her legacy endures, not just as a powerful ruler or a reformer, but as someone who understood the game of power and played it on her terms. She didn't apologize for being brilliant, complicated, or human. And maybe that's why the world tried so hard to reduce her to something laughable, because it's easier to joke about a myth than to admit that a woman reshaped an empire without permission. Catherine ruled with vision, ambition, and yes, a healthy romantic appetite. She knew her worth, picked her battles, and ran a country better than most men before or after her. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, good. She'd probably enjoy that. Long before Romeo ever uttered his first "wherefore," and centuries before love was measured in emojis and passive-aggressive Spotify playlists, there were Heloise and Abelard. Their story had everything: genius, intellect, age, inappropriate tutoring, forbidden passion, a surprised child, a brutal castration, and a lifetime of whispered letters across cloister walls. If that's not romance with a side of trauma, what is? Let's set the stage. 12th century Paris, a city of cathedrals and candlelit manuscripts. Peter Abelard was a rock star scholar, the kind of man who could argue theology with popes and still have time to roast his rivals in verse. He was arrogant, brilliant, and knew it. Teaching at Notre Dame, Abelard was the intellectual heartthrob of his day. Picture a medieval TED Talk speaker with the ego of Kanye and the brain of Einstein. Enter Heloise, She was younger, stunningly intelligent, and already known in intellectual circles for her knowledge of classical languages and philosophy. Not just smart for a girl, smart actually brilliant. Her uncle, Canon Fulbert, a minor church official with major ambitions, hired Abelard to tutor her. He agreed not out of generosity, but because he wanted to get closer to her. In Abelard's own words, her home became a school of love. That's not a metaphor. He seduced her while pretending to teach her Latin. What followed was one of the most explosive affairs in European history. Secret meetings, poetic exchanges, enough chemistry to power all of France. Heloise fell hard. Abelard did too, though he tended to intellectualize his passion with long philosophical detours. They snuck around Fulbert's house like hormonal teenagers in a Jane Austen remake. Eventually, Heloise got pregnant, the ultimate medieval mic drop. Abelard whisked her away to Brittany to give birth. The baby was named Astrolabe, which honestly sounds like the love child of a telescope and a Marvel villain. While there, Abelard proposed marriage. Heloise, ever the pragmatist and maybe a bit allergic to convention, refused. She knew marriage would damage his career and credibility. She argued that love, in its purest form, shouldn't be shackled by contracts. She wanted passion and freedom, not rings and obligations. In a letter later, she asked, "God is my witness, that if Augustus, emperor of the whole world, thought me worthy of the honor of marriage, I would rather be your mistress than his empress. That's not love, that's scorched earth devotion." Eventually, though, they did marry in secret. Fulbert found out and, in a rare burst of unholy vengeance, hired men to break into Abelard's room at night and, well, remove the offending anatomy. With a knife. Not metaphorically. Abelard was castrated, physically broken, emotionally humiliated, and now functionally removed from both church and bedroom. He fled to a monastery. Heloise, pressured by family and circumstance, became a nun. But here's where it gets even more complicated. They kept writing to each other, and the letters, the letters, full of theology, passion, recriminations, longing. Abelard repented. Heloise raged. She didn't want forgiveness, she wanted him. Even as she took her vows and rose to become abbess of her convent, she never stopped loving him. She reminded him, often, that her heart was still his, that she wore the habit, but dreamed of their nights in Fulbert's house. "At night, I never lie down to sleep," she wrote, "without turning over in my mind what we have done." Abelard, ever the philosopher, tried to make peace with their suffering by framing it as divine punishment and spiritual growth. He wrote books, he debated bishops, he lectured on sin and grace, always with an undertone of loss. Heloise, meanwhile, kept pushing back. She challenged his theology, questioned his logic, and called him out for hiding behind God when he should have been brave enough to own their story. And what a story it was. They weren't just lovers torn apart by fate. They were two of the most brilliant minds of their generation, wrestling with love, identity, and the sharp edge between faith and flesh. Their tragedy wasn't that they couldn't be together. It was that the world couldn't make space for a love that didn't fit its rules. They died apart but not unremembered. Abelard died first in 1142, exiled from the church he once dominated. Heloise followed 20 years later. Legend says they were buried together. When their tombs were opened in the 19th century to be moved to Père Lachaise cemetery, people claimed their skeletons had turned toward each other. Were the letters real? Probably. Were the passions exaggerated by later historians? Maybe. But the ache they carried, the sense of two souls circling each other through parchment and prayer, that part feels timeless. Because long before love was filtered through likes and DMs, Heloise and Abelard wrote themselves into eternity. And despite the scandal, the pain, and the uncle with the knife, they managed to leave behind one of the most intimate portraits of human love, flawed, fierce, and forever unfinished. When Edward VIII became king in 1936, he inherited the British crown, a royal lineage stretching back centuries, and a job description that included "don't embarrass the entire monarchy." That last part, unfortunately, was where things went spectacularly off the rails. Within a year, he'd handed the crown over to his younger brother and walked off the throne not because of war, scandal, or death, but because he couldn't legally marry the woman he loved. Sounds romantic, right? Like something out of a fairy tale where love conquers all. Except this fairy tale also includes Nazis, political missteps, and one very expensive trip to the Bahamas. Let's start with the woman in question. Wallis Simpson was an American socialite, elegant and sharp-tongued, with a knack for turning heads and ruffling feathers. She was twice divorced, which in 1930s Britain was about as scandalous as throwing a rave in Westminster Abbey. To the British establishment, and more importantly, the Church of England, she was entirely unacceptable as queen. Divorced people weren't allowed to remarry in church, and the king was also head of that very church. That made the whole situation a little complicated. But Edward didn't care. He wasn't exactly a model monarch. Before he even took the throne, he'd already been raising eyebrows with his disinterest in official duties, his playboy lifestyle, and his open affection for Wallis. When his father, George V, died and Edward became king, everyone hoped or begged he'd calm down. He didn't. Instead, he pushed harder. He wanted to marry Wallis. Parliament said absolutely not. The church said absolutely not. His own ministers threatened to resign. The newspapers held back the scandal for a while, the pre-Twitter era, but eventually it exploded, and Edward made his choice. He abdicated. In December 1936, he gave a radio address, telling the British people he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. Cue swoons, cue tears, cue royal panic. His younger brother, Albert, shy, stammering, and entirely unprepared, became George VI. You might know him as the guy from The King's Speech. Edward, now styled the Duke of Windsor, was promptly exiled. He married Wallis the next year in France. The royal family didn't attend the wedding. The British government didn't send congratulations. It was love, sure, but it came with a cold shoulder from an entire empire. That might have been the end of it, a romantic tragedy, a royal rebel, a forbidden love story. But then came the Nazi problem. You see, Edward and Wallis weren't just outsiders. They were also politically curious. During the years leading up to World War II, they maintained social ties with high-ranking Nazis. They visited Germany in 1937 and met Hitler. Yes, that Hitler. There are photos. Edward smiled. Wallis curtsied. The whole thing was very cozy and incredibly alarming to anyone paying attention. British intelligence grew concerned. There were rumors hard to verify, but persistent, that Edward had sympathies for the Nazi regime, or at the very least, saw it as a useful tool against communism, and maybe even a way to reclaim influence. There were whispers of plans to reinstate him as king if Germany successfully invaded Britain. MI5 monitored them. Churchill fumed. At one point, the British government literally sent Edward and Wallis to the Bahamas not for the sun, but to keep them as far away from Europe and power as possible. Edward didn't take to the Caribbean life well. He complained about the heat. He found the work of governing colonial subjects tedious. Wallis, too, was restless, once the most talked-about woman in the Western world, now trapped on a tropical outpost with bad cocktails and worse company. They lived out the war years mostly ignored, mostly irrelevant, and always a little bitter. After the war, they settled in France. They hosted dinner parties, rubbed shoulders with celebrities, and tried to reinvent themselves as elder statespeople of love. But the British royal family never really forgave them. Wallis was never given the style of Her Royal Highness. Edward rarely returned to Britain. And when he died in 1972, he was buried near Windsor Castle, but not next to Wallis, who wouldn't join him there until 1986. So what are we left with? A king who gave up everything for love, and a love that was never fully accepted. Edward and Wallis were either martyrs to romance or cautionary tales of misplaced priorities, depending on who you ask. Was it noble? Maybe. Was it selfish? Almost certainly. Was it romantic? Only if you ignore the fascism. In the end, their story isn't really about one grand gesture. It's about two people who believed love could outweigh duty, and discovered too late that the world wasn't ready for that equation. Edward lost his crown, Wallis lost her place, and history, ever judgmental, gave them a legacy that feels less like a fairy tale and more like a warning label. Henry VIII wasn't exactly the strong, silent type. When he loved, he did it loudly, through opulent gestures, public declarations, handwritten sonnets, and occasionally dramatic executions. Picture the energy of someone who sends flowers on the first date, proposes on the second, and burns your house down on the third if you hesitate. That was Henry, Renaissance monarch, self-declared heartthrob, and the most dangerously romantic man to ever sit on the English throne. It started innocently enough. Young Henry wasn't always the bloated tyrant we picture today. He was athletic, charismatic, and reportedly handsome enough to make the court swoon. A golden boy with a lute in one hand and a falcon on the other. But underneath the courtly veneer beat the heart of a man who believed in divine right, absolute control, and getting what he wanted, especially when it came to women. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, and his brother's widow. Their marriage lasted over 20 years, which is practically diamond anniversary material in Tudor terms. But after multiple miscarriages and just one surviving daughter, Henry grew restless. He wanted a son, an heir, a shiny male miniature version of himself. And Catherine, noble and pious as she was, could no longer provide that. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne was clever, stylish, and just unavailable enough to drive Henry into a frenzy. Unlike other court ladies, she refused to be his mistress. She wanted marriage, a crown. She held out for the top prize, and Henry, besotted, determined, and increasingly unhinged, decided to give it to her. But there was a slight problem: his current wife and the Pope. When the Catholic Church denied his request for an annulment, Henry said, "Cool, I'll just invent a new church," which he did. He separated England from Rome, declared himself the supreme head of the church, and got the divorce he craved. The Reformation, it turns out, was less about theology and more about lust and dynasty. The love letters Henry wrote to Anne during this time are surprisingly tender, even a little awkward. He called her "mine own sweetheart" and gushed about her pretty duckies, translation, her breasts. Yes, really. These notes survive in the Vatican archives, probably because the Pope appreciated the irony. In them, we see Henry as a man in love no just with Anne, but with the idea of himself as her heroic suitor, a king who defies nations for love. Anne finally got her crown. She also got pregnant, which seemed like a win until the baby was a girl. That girl would grow up to be Queen Elizabeth I, but Henry was underwhelmed at the time. Still, he waited. Anne miscarried again, and again. Meanwhile, Henry's gaze began drifting. When Anne didn't deliver the male heir he wanted, and when her sharp wit turned from flirtatious to fractious, Henry's love curdled into suspicion. He had her arrested for adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were likely fabricated. Her trial was a show trial. In 1536, she was executed by sword. Clean, efficient, and horrifying. Henry moved on before the blood dried. Wife number 3, Jane Seymour, gave him the son he wanted. Edward but died in childbirth. Henry mourned her deeply. Some say she was the only wife he truly loved. That's up for debate. What's not is that he married 3 more women after her. Anne of Cleves was next. A political match gone wrong. Henry complained she looked nothing like her portrait, and had the marriage annulled after 6 months. No beheading here. Anne got a pension and a quiet life. She was one of the lucky ones. Then came Catherine Howard, young, vivacious, and, unfortunately, reckless. She had lovers before and during the marriage, or so the court claimed. Henry, now aging and bitter, didn't take it well. She was executed too. Another wife, another scaffold. Finally, Catherine Parr, who managed to outlive him. By that point, Henry was more ulcer than man. hobbling through the palace in pain and paranoia. Catherine Parr nursed him, debated theology with him, and probably slept with one eye open. Looking back, Henry's love life was less a string of romances and more a series of cautionary tales. He loved deeply, obsessively, and dangerously. His affection could elevate a woman to the throne, and his discontent could send her to the block. The line between adoration and annihilation was thin, and he walked it with all the grace of a man wielding both a quill and an axe. His love letters survive, yes, but they read like the early drafts of a man who mistook obsession for affection. He wrote with urgency, with fire, with poetry, but his actions always burned hotter than his words. Henry wasn't just writing love letters, he was writing ultimatums. And if history had a Most Toxic Ex award, he'd take it home every year. In the end, Henry VIII wasn't just a king in love, he was a warning, a reminder that passion, unchecked, can rewrite nations, tear down churches, and leave a trail of hearts and heads in its wake. Romance meet regime change. They met in Texas. During the Great Depression, two kids in their early 20s, jobless, restless, and already halfway down the path toward infamy. Bonnie Parker was a waitress and sometime poet. Clyde Barrow was a small-time thief with a bad attitude and a better aim. Together, they became America's most stylish outlaws, the doomed lovers of the machine gun age, and living proof that you can still go viral in the 1930s if your mugshot is good enough. Bonnie was 5 feet tall, sharp-featured, and had a talent for words. She wrote moody verses about love, death, and cheap whiskey. She wanted to be famouser, at least more than another waitress, pouring stale coffee in West Dallas. Clyde, on the other hand, had already been in and out of prison for stealing cars and turkeys. Yes, turkeys. He hated authority and loved fast getaways. They met in 1930 at a friend's house, and from that moment on, it was game over for reason, law, and long-term planning. The thing about Bonnie and Clyde is that they weren't exactly criminal masterminds. Their early crimes were mostly chaotic, low-budget, and messy. Clyde robbed gas stations and hardware stores. He wasn't hitting Fort Knox. He just had a short temper and a fast trigger finger. Bonnie didn't always pull the gun, but she was there, cigarette dangling, ready to bolt when things went sideways. And they often did. Their partnership became legend because of how inseparable they were, two outlaws wrapped up in love, gasoline, and the smell of cordite. They took pictures of themselves goofing off with rifles, striking glamorous poses next to getaway cars, and flipping off the camera decades before it became cliché. Bonnie in berets and heels, Clyde in suits and scowls. They looked more like jazz-age rebels than criminals, which made them irresistible to the public. America was in a rough place. Banks were foreclosing homes, people were starving, and here were Bonnie and Clyde robbing banks, laughing, outrunning the cops. They became anti-heroes, romanticized in newspaper headlines and pulp fiction. But the reality was bloodier than the photo shoots. They didn't just rob banks. Clyde shot cops. Bonnie helped break prisoners out of jail. They killed people, at least 9 officers, and a handful of civilians. They weren't Robin Hood. They didn't give to the poor. They took what they wanted and left bodies behind. But the myth didn't care. To a nation knee-deep in dust and debt, they looked like freedom. Still, the myth had its cracks. They were constantly on the run, sleeping in stolen cabins, hiding in ditches, and eating cold beans out of cans. Bonnie was badly injured in a car crash. During a police escape, her leg got burned so badly she could barely walk afterward. Clyde drove with a limp. They were young, yes, but battered. Like ghosts running out of road. Eventually, the law caught up. Texas Ranger Frank Hamer was brought out of retirement to track them down. He was old school, relentless, and had no interest in romanticizing outlaws. In May 1934, he set a trap in Louisiana. Bonnie and Clyde drove right into it. What happened next wasn't a gunfight, it was a massacre. Officers riddled their car with over 130 bullets. Clyde was shot in the head. Bonnie's last moments were screams and shattered glass. Their bodies were so torn apart, that even hardened cops reportedly looked away. The two most wanted lovers in America died in broad daylight, not even 25 years old. But death didn't kill the myth. If anything, it embalmed it. People gathered by the thousands to see their bodies. Souvenir hunters tried to steal locks of Bonnie's hair and Clyde's bloody shirt. Their bullet-riddled car went on tour. Decades later, songs, movies, and fan fiction turned their crime spree into something dangerously close to a love story. The 1967 film, Bonnie and Clyde, made them counterculture icons. Their images still float around Pinterest like noir prom photos. What's strange what lingers is how easily people forget the blood in favor of the pose. Bonnie and Clyde weren't just lovers on the run. They were violent, desperate, and dragging a trail of trauma behind them. But they also wrote poems to each other. Bonnie's poem, The Trail's End, closes with eerie prophecy. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. That's how she wanted to be remembered, not as a killer or an accomplice, but as half of a doomed duo. And in some twisted way, she got her wish. They weren't buried side by side, Bonnie's family refused, but in history, they're inseparable. So here they are, nearly a century later. Bonnie, Clyde, a Tommy gun, and a car full of bullet holes. A love story soaked in gasoline and sealed with a gunshot. Still iconic, still disturbing, still mistaken for romance.